Thank you, Betsy, and thanks to all of you for coming today. I know when you take an intellectual sampler, I guess you never know what you're going to get. So some of you get to hear a story about a college basketball player, and maybe that's something that is of interest to a lot of you, and maybe it's not to some of you. And those are my favorite people to talk to, because I think Perry's story is about so much more than just basketball. And I had a really good illustration of this. A couple weeks ago, I was speaking at a book club at a coffee shop in Franklin, and one of the women admitted to me that when she found out her book club was reading the book, she really didn't want to read it, and she said that she and her husband share a Kindle device, and that's how she reads her books, is on their Kindle. And he happened to pick up the Kindle, and he said, "Honey, I think someone's hacked our Kindle. There's a book about basketball on here." And she said, "Oh no, I'm actually really reading that for our book club." And this is my first chance to get to speak at the temple or at a synagogue about this story. And I've had, over the last 2 years since the book came out, a lot of new experiences, which has been really fun. And I've learned a couple new advantages to being an author, first-time author in my case. I was in Kansas City a month ago, and was speaking to a Vanderbilt alumni group there, and then at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas the next day. And I was meeting a family friend at a restaurant in Kansas City. He told me where to go, and I don't know Kansas City, so he directed me to what probably wasn't the very best neighborhood in Kansas City, but I had a really fancy Mustang convertible rental car, and which was completely sort of out of character for me. And I arrived at this restaurant early and was just sitting in the car waiting for him to show up. And this guy came up from behind, and he just knocked on the window. And it kind of startled me, and I don't know if he was interested in the car or interested in asking me for something or what, but he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm an author." And then he looked as startled as I did, and he's like, "That's a job? You can make money doing that?" And I said, "Well, not really." And then he just walked away. So I've learned that just declaring yourself an author can get you out of conversations you would rather not be having. But I'm really excited to talk to you. This is a conversation I definitely want to have, and I've put up there's a new kids version of the book out, and that's what that cover is. I've got both of them here if anyone's interested, but in December, a version of this book for middle school and high school kids came out. And so that's what I've been doing since the end of December, is traveling around to schools around the country, telling Perry Wallace's story to kids, which has been the most rewarding experience of my life probably. And I've decided from here on out I'm just going to write for kids from the very beginning. And for anybody that doesn't know, Perry Wallace was the first African-American basketball player in the Southeastern Conference. He was from Nashville. He played here at Vanderbilt, and today he's a law professor at American University in Washington, D.C. And I'll tell you the story in the middle there, but just wanted to get you off knowing what we're talking about here from the beginning. For me, writing about sports has been something that I've been interested in doing ever since I was a kid myself. This is when I was in middle school in 1983. I wrote this little magazine called AJ's Sports Journal. And my middle name's James, so that's where AJ comes from. And this wasn't for a class paper or a project for a grade or anything. It's just something I wanted to do for fun. And I wrote about my favorite baseball and football teams, the Milwaukee Brewers, the American League East. I picked them to win 100 games. They actually lost 100 games that year. I wrote this editorial. The Packers had just fired Bart Starr as their head coach. And I had this editorial. I said it wasn't the coach's fault that they lost all those games. So I don't know why it wouldn't be the coach's fault. So I really wasn't that smart of a kid, I guess, back then. And then I wrote an interview with John Feinstein, who many of you may have heard as a commentator on NPR or a best-selling author. At the time, he was just a cub reporter at the Washington Post. And he wasn't even covering sports yet. He was a Metro reporter at the Post. He was friends of my mom and dad, and he came over, and I interviewed him for my sports journal. And you can see at the bottom, I was trying to charge $1.75 for this magazine, but I still have it, so nobody even bought it at $1.75. Okay, so then this is 6 years later. My handwriting got slightly better. 1989, I had come to Nashville. I was born in Wisconsin. I grew up in Washington, D.C. We moved to Austin, Texas when I was in high school. And then thanks to Fred Russell, who many of you probably know, the old sports editor of the Nashville Banner, there's the Russell Grantland Rice Sports Writing Scholarship at Vanderbilt. And I was lucky enough to win that, and that's what brought me here to Nashville. And so I didn't really know anything about my new town or new school or anything, but I was interested in sports and history. I was a history major. And my sophomore year, 1989, which is 19 years after Perry Wallace graduated, was the very first time that Vanderbilt ever invited him back to campus to be honored for being the Jackie Robinson of the SEC. And so this just happened to be when I was a student here. And so there was media coverage of Perry Wallace coming back to Nashville. And there was a kid at Vandy who was a year ahead of me named Dave Sheinin, who's now a highly regarded sports writer at the Washington Post. But he was just a year ahead of me writing for Versus magazine, which was a campus magazine at the time. And he wrote this story about Perry that just grabbed me. And it was the lead. And when I talk to kids at schools now, I say, you know, the power of a story can change your whole life. And really, it was the power of 2 or 3 paragraphs at the beginning of Dave's story that really has set the course for the rest of my life and, you know, getting me interested in this character, Perry Wallace. And it talked about the first game that Perry ever played in Starkville, Mississippi in the winter of 1967. And in those days in college, as a freshman, you couldn't play on the varsity. You played on the freshman team. And Vanderbilt had actually recruited 2 African-American players. And so Perry had one other black teammate, Godfrey Dillard. And here they are as freshmen going to Mississippi, becoming the first African-American players ever to play in Starkville. And Dave's article began with the scene at halftime. And this is after the plane from Nashville lands in Starkville, and Perry and Godfrey look out, and there are students there shaking the Vanderbilt bus on the tarmac and waiting for them at the team hotel and harassing them for the entire first half of the game and pouring Cokes on them, flicking coins at them, spitting on them, saying they're going to lynch them after the game. And so at halftime, while the rest of the team is listening to the instructions of their coach, Perry and Godfrey are sitting there holding hands to gain the courage to go out and play the second half of the basketball game. And that's the scene that Dave described. And that's what captured my attention. And so I asked my professor, Dr. Yolette Jones, who's now a dean of arts and science at Vanderbilt. I think this was her first year as a professor there. If I could write a paper about Perry for my black history class that I was taking, that she was teaching. And I thought she was going to say no, that this is Vanderbilt and sports isn't a serious academic pursuit, and, you know, find a more serious topic than that. But thankfully, she said, yes, if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should do. And so I called Perry, and when I talk to the kids now, I tell them this was before the internet was around, you know, so I wasn't able to Google him or email him, and they're just stunned by that. And I found him in the phone book, and he was, they were like, what's a phone book, you know, and so he was a professor in Baltimore. And I just talked to him and scribbled down in a reporter's notepad, and I wrote this paper in 1989. And then I was a lazy enough student that the next year I wrote another paper about Perry, and I was the sports editor of The Hustler, the Vanderbilt student newspaper, and wrote some columns saying that the new Student Rec Center, which they had just built, should be named after this person that made history at our school. And I was too naive to know that it takes millions of dollars, you know, to get a building named after you, not just making history. So that building still doesn't have a name on it. If anybody has millions of dollars and would like to name it after Perry. So this is how everything got started for me, and now it's turned into 2 books. And so the first book there on the left is the adult version. That took me 8 years to write. I started in 2006, and I was standing in my in-laws' kitchen in Brentwood and declared that I was going to write a book. And so my father-in-law said, what about? And I was stumped. And I think he thought that his daughter had made a big mistake. So we were just talking about it, and he said, well, what about Perry Wallace? You're always talking about Perry Wallace. And I guess I had been too close to see. You know, of course that's what I should write about. And so immediately, internet was around by then, and I Googled to make sure that nobody had already written a book about Perry. And then I emailed him and asked if he remembered me from this paper back in 1989, and he said yes, and that he thought that I understood him, and that I wasn't, asking for him to help me write the book. It wasn't, I wasn't a ghostwriter on this. I didn't necessarily need his approval or permission to write about him, but I wanted to know that he was okay with it and that he would give me the time needed for all the interviews and that he cared to share these stories that were very painful stories for him. And he said, go for it. And so I did, and I spent from 2006 to 2010 just on research before I ever wrote a single word of the book. So I interviewed 100 people and spent a lot of time at the Vanderbilt Archives and Special Collections, the Downtown Library, Civil Rights Room, traveling to Oxford, Mississippi, and Starkville, and Lexington, Kentucky, and Knoxville, and the places that Perry played, and just gathering as much information as I could to write a real book, that would be respected not just by sports fans, but more important, by historians or students of civil rights movement, because I wanted to put Perry's story really into the context of the place and times that he was operating in, and not just write about the scores of basketball games or statistics, but tell a real civil rights story of a figure that most people have never heard of. So this is Perry when he was a little kid. And he grew up in North Nashville. He went to Elliott Elementary, which is near in Germantown, if you've ever been to Germantown Cafe, very close to that restaurant. And he had 4 older sisters. His parents, his mom was a cleaning lady at downtown buildings like the Benny Dillon office building downtown. His father was a bricklayer. And so they didn't have a whole lot of money, but they put all 4 of Perry's older sisters through college at either TSU or Fisk. His older brother, James, served in the Air Force. Perry played the trumpet 4 hours a day. He liked it, but he didn't love practicing 4 hours a day, and he told me he knew it was 4 hours because he set a timer, and he just couldn't wait for that 4 hours to be up. But, he was very, very serious about it. The Hadley Park Library, which is still there over by Hadley Park, Perry would walk there on weekends just to read. He told me he read books by Walter White of the NAACP about lynchings in the South. And this is just as a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid. At that same age, he was listening to his older sister's foreign language records. And he said in those days, that's how you learned in schools. You had a record that played this language, and that by the time he got to high school, he could already speak some Spanish and Italian and German and all the languages that his older sisters had taken. He was especially into math and science. And he said that he was a Sputnik-affected kid. And he said his teachers were really pushing, now there's this renewed emphasis in STEM, in science and math. And he said that was the same thing back then. People were concerned about the space race and the Sputnik. And so he caught that bug, and math and science were what he was into. And at Vanderbilt, he majored in engineering because of that same love of math and science. Last thing on here, he played basketball. And he really wasn't an early bloomer at basketball. He was probably 9 years old the first time he ever even picked up a basketball. And he caught the bug when the Philadelphia Warriors came to town to play an exhibition game at Tennessee State. And Wilt Chamberlain was the star of the Philadelphia team, and he was dunking. And Perry thought this was the coolest thing he had ever seen. And he said, I want to be just like Wilt. And so a lot of times people dismiss an athlete's abilities as saying they're born with it. Perry wasn't a born dunker. This is something he worked very hard on, and strengthening his legs and learning to dunk. And it took him 3 years, but by the time he was 12 years old, he could dunk the basketball, which is pretty amazing. And when I go speak to schools, this is the thing that Perry wants me to get across. And I've talked to him about this. And he'll say ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And he was just an ordinary kid. People weren't writing books or making movies about him as a kid. He was from a family that didn't have much money, and there weren't many expectations for what he could do. But he'll tell the kids, that he worked hard and he had these goals. And that's what got him somewhere. But it certainly was not easy. And one of the things I emphasize in the book is that Perry's story tracks so closely with so many significant moments or people in the history of the civil rights movement in Nashville, but not just in Nashville. So you guys recognize this picture, but before this, in 1954, year of Brown versus Board, that was the year that Perry started kindergarten. So he's starting school the same year that schools are finally maybe beginning to change in this country. A couple years later, when Emmett Till is murdered, Perry's around Emmett Till's age, and he said that he was profoundly influenced by that event. And then here in 1960, when the lunch counter sit-ins were happening in Nashville, Perry was a 12-year-old kid, and he said that he would sneak downtown from North Nashville and stand outside these lunch counters and watch what was happening with his own eyes. And he said his parents would have killed him if they knew what he was doing. But he knew history was being made, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. And so even before he became a civil rights figure of his own, he was learning from these college students who are out there involved, and he was inspired by them. Okay, and then in August 1963, Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. Perry Wallace starts high school at Pearl High School a week later. While he's in high school, you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And Perry told me that with all of these things happening, he began to feel some sense of momentum and optimism that things were changing in the country, and that there would be opportunities coming for him and for his classmates that hadn't been there for their older siblings or certainly for their parents, and that he wanted to be prepared to take advantage of these new opportunities that he expected were coming. And so Perry was prepared in two important ways. For one thing, he was prepared as a basketball player, and that's him in the middle with his teammates James Douglas and Walter Fisher. And the reason they're holding that rim is because all three of them ripped it off the backboard during a game. And they told me this story. It was in a state tournament game. They had a point guard that was really fast. He was probably too fast, and often he'd go flying towards the basket and bounce the ball too hard off the backboard. And so they were always prepared to scoop up the rebound and score an easy basket. And one time, all three of them were prepared to do that, and they all jumped up to get the ball at the same time. And Walter Fisher on the right, who's a really funny guy, said they're all up there in the air basically looking at each other like, what are you doing up here? They all dunked it in at the same time, and they ripped the rim off the backboard. But this Pearl team was a great team. I think they had every single player on the team could dunk, even the shortest point guard. I think they had 8 players that played college basketball off this high school team. And they won 3 state championships here in Tennessee, including in 1966 was the first year that the TSSAA allowed the white schools and the black schools to play together in the same state tournament. And that year, Pearl went undefeated and won the state championship at Memorial Gym here against Treadwell High School from Memphis, which at the time was an all-white school. And coincidentally, that state championship game happened on March 19th, 1966, which is also considered sort of a landmark date in college basketball history. That's the same night that Texas Western beat Kentucky in the NCAA title game, and Texas Western had an all-black starting lineup, the first to win the NCAA championship, and Kentucky was still all-white at the time. That's the game that the movie Glory Road is made about. Those games were happening at the same time. So that was a fun chapter to write in this book. And so Perry was the valedictorian at Pearl High School, and the starting star center on the best team in the state. So he was prepared as a basketball player, but more important to Perry is this other picture. He was prepared as a student. Like I said, valedictorian, and he actually saw basketball as just a means to an end, as a way to get a scholarship to college. His parents had spent pretty much all of their money getting his 4 older sisters through college, but also he wanted a college scholarship as a way to get out of the South. Having grown up in segregated Nashville, his dream was to get a scholarship as far away from here as he possibly could. And he was recruited by many schools in the Big Ten, and that was what his dream was. That's what he thought he was going to do. So he visited schools like Michigan and Wisconsin and Iowa, and Northwestern. Even John Wooden and his great teams at UCLA recruited Perry. And Perry said that he strongly considered UCLA until he realized that their starting center name was Lou Alcindor. And Perry was never going to get to play if he went to UCLA. So he crossed them off the list. But then pretty soon he began crossing all of these other schools off his list also. And that's because he was beginning to see sort of the ugly side of college sports that you still see today. He'd go visit one of these Big Ten schools, and the coaches would say, if you come here, you don't really have to worry about going to class. We'll keep you eligible, or we'll just find the easiest classes for you. You're just here to play basketball. And he saw players who were already up there on the team basically just going from their dorms to basketball practice and back, and not really stopping at class anywhere along the way. And Perry, I told you he's an engineer, but I think he's a poet at heart. And the phrase that he used for me in the book was that he wasn't going to trade one plantation for another, and that he wasn't going to leave the Deep South just to go to one of these other schools to be exploited, as a strong athlete. And so his dream sort of comes crashing down in a way. And at that point, he begins to take Vanderbilt seriously, which in some ways makes sense. It's just a couple miles from his house, but it's really worlds apart. And until he was 16 years old in 1964, Vanderbilt was not admitting African-American students as undergraduates. So it wasn't like his whole life he had been following the Vanderbilt basketball team or thinking this is where he was going to go to college. They wouldn't have let him in until he was 16. And so this is one of my favorite pictures, which is probably one of the worst pictures you'll ever see. But one day during this 4 years that I was working on the research for the book, Perry flew down from Washington, D.C., and we just drove around Nashville. And he showed me the houses that he grew up in and all the schools that he went to and the parks that he played in. And we were over by the Metro Center area, near the Luby Library and the baseball field over there. And he said, pull the car over, I want you to see something. And this is what he showed me. And I said, well, Perry, what is this? And in the middle, you can kind of see there's a rock covered by those leaves. And he said, that's the rock that I sat on and prayed over my decision whether I was going to come to Vanderbilt or not. And so it was really cool for me as a research geek, to see the rock that he sat on 50 years ago, making this historic decision to become the first African-American player in the SEC. And the reason he really did it was when he came to visit Vandy, he saw the players actually going to class. And shocker, right? And he was impressed by the engineering department. And Coach Skinner addressed his parents as Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, which he said was a sign of respect that they often didn't get from white men at that time. They would be called by their first names. And so he said, I can put my future in this person's hand. He seems like a decent person. And so this is the history-making shot. I think about a month ago they had National Signing Day. Currently, where high school players announce where they're going to go play in college. This would have been National Signing Day in 1966. And that's Perry Sr. and Hattie Wallace and Coach Skinner. And behind them is Clyde Lee in that picture, who was the star of the 1965 Vandy team, which some people still consider the best team in Vanderbilt history. But at that moment, Perry's making history, becoming the Jackie Robinson of the SEC. And when, so Perry comes, and he has this phrase that he uses now, and I wish he would have told me this when I was interviewing him for the book, because I love this phrase, but I've heard him say it, and he'll say that we can all treat each other in any of three ways. You can be treated well, you can be treated poorly, or you can not be treated at all. And Perry began to be treated all three of those types of ways from the very beginning at Vanderbilt. And it even started before his first day of class. So that last picture, there's Clyde Lee. And Clyde had grown up in the Church of Christ in Nashville, white church. Perry had grown up in the Church of Christ in Nashville, black church. But when Clyde showed Perry around campus, when Perry was a high school senior and they were recruiting him, one of the spots that Clyde showed Perry was what was known as the University Church of Christ, which was right across the street from campus, where the IHOP used to be, and that crazy intersection that's hard to turn left on, over by Mellow Mushroom now. That's where this church was. Now it's a solar parking lot. So Clyde said, this is where you should go. And Perry said growing up in segregated Nashville, he never would have considered going to a white church, but now he was a pioneer, and this is what pioneers did, new things, and that there was no Governor Wallace standing at the door blocking him, and so he was going to give it a shot. And this is in August, before his first classes have started. He's already moved onto the campus just to get there early and learn his way around. And so he starts going to this church, and for 3 Sundays, he walks in and sits in the back, and he's left alone or ignored, depending how you want to look at it. And the 4th Sunday, he walks in, and some older church members call him aside into a side conference room, and they say, "Perry, you can't keep coming here anymore. There's members of our church who say they will write the church out of their wills if you keep coming to our church, and so you can't keep coming anymore. And in fact, you can't even stay today. You have to leave right now." And so before his first day of class, Perry's already been kicked out of a church. And he has to walk back to his dormitory, and plop down on his bed and take off his coat and tie. And you could just imagine how many of us would have quit this pioneering experiment after that welcome to the Vanderbilt community. His best friend in high school was named Walter Murray, who was the salutatorian at Pearl High School, and he followed Perry to Vanderbilt. And there's now a freshman dormitory at Vandy named after Walter Murray, which is pretty remarkable when you consider Walter Murray's first day of English class. He walked in, and the professor looked at him and said, "So I see they've let the N-words in after all." He says that to Walter Murray on his first day of class. And so you see the ways Perry says you can be treated 3 ways, not being treated well. It's happening from the very beginning. On the basketball court, he wasn't treated so well either. His freshman year, University of Mississippi, Ole Miss canceled both of its games against Vanderbilt rather than play against the team that had a black player. And so it's not until his sophomore year that Perry becomes the first African-American player ever to play a game in Oxford, Mississippi. And by this time, his friend and fellow black teammate Godfrey Dillard has transferred, or actually that year he's injured. And so Perry is down there basically alone with his teammates who didn't really understand what he was up against. And in the first half of the game, he takes an elbow to the face, and he's bleeding. Perry is from his nose. He can't see out of one of his eyes. He's dizzy. The refs don't call a foul. They don't whistle a stop to the game. And so it's not until the ball rolls out of bounds that the team trainer and student manager are able to come out on the court to help Perry. And I talked to both of these guys, and they said as they walked him across the court to the Vanderbilt locker room, the crowd was cheering the fact that Perry was injured. And they were feeling wet, and it was because people, again, were dumping Cokes and spitting on them. And they walk into the locker room, and as the halftime clock runs down and the second half of the game is about to begin, everybody associated with the Vanderbilt team leaves the locker room. They leave Perry on the training table alone. And they run back to do their warm-ups, their layups before the start of the second half. And Perry said what would have been an ordinary walk back for him to the Vanderbilt bench, an ordinary walk for anybody else, was a long, hellish trauma for him, knowing he was going to have to walk through that tunnel out onto the court where all these fans have been harassing him, and they're waiting on him. And, they're shouting these epithets at him that people who are listening back here in Nashville on the radio can hear. And he said that, I asked him, how did you approach these road trips when you looked at the schedule each year and saw games coming up in Oxford and Starkville and Auburn and Tuscaloosa, Gainesville, Baton Rouge? And he said, I approached it with the deepest sense of dread. And he would imagine what's the worst thing that could happen on one of these trips. And in his mind, it was that he would be shot and killed, either out on the court during a game or around town before or after one of these games. And when he mentioned that to me, initially I had kind of this reaction of, did you really think you would get shot and killed? I mean, that's never happened before in a game, thankfully. But then I thought about it, this very same time, people with a lot more maybe protection or around them, like Martin Luther King or RFK, people were getting shot that had a lot more prominence than Perry Wallace. So who's to say it couldn't have happened to him? And what courage he had to get on the airplane and try to play a basketball game with all of that on his mind. And so you see the obvious ways he wasn't treated well. He was treated well by some people. This other way you can be treated. The University Chancellor, Alexander Hurd, was the one that had encouraged Coach Skinner to recruit an African-American player in the first place. And the reason goes back to the same 1960 sit-ins that Perry had seen with his own eyes. And many of you know is Reverend James Lawson, who was leading the students in these protests. He was a Vanderbilt Divinity School student at the time. And when the university administration learned it was one of its own students involved, they didn't thank Reverend Lawson. They expelled him from the university. And this was a time when Vanderbilt was trying to become known as more of a national institution and not just a strong Southern school. And so the national media coverage after the expulsion of Reverend Lawson was very negative. And in response, the new, more progressive Chancellor, Alexander Hurd, was brought in. And Chancellor Hurd's daughter, Connie, is now a professor at the Blair School of Music at Vanderbilt. And I interviewed her for the book, and she said that most people knew that he was fairly forward-thinking on race, but they didn't understand that he was a big sports fan. And she gave me some examples of that. She said he was a walking baseball encyclopedia. He knew all the statistics of the old Philadelphia Athletics. And so for better or worse, Chancellor Hurd understood the role that sports plays in American culture, and that people pay attention to it. And so he called Coach Skinner into his office and said, Roy, you can recruit a black player, and in fact, I would like you to. And he wanted to send a signal through sports that people would notice that the university was changing. And so right across town, you had the best player, valedictorian, on the best team in the state. And so Perry was the obvious candidate to recruit. So Chancellor Hurd was supportive of Perry when he arrived on campus. Reverend Bev Asbury, some of you probably knew Reverend Asbury, was very supportive of Perry, would have him over to his house for meals. Vereen Bell, English professor, would do the same. There were some students that had gone to integrated high schools that befriended Perry, and there was a small group of African-American students on campus. So Perry did receive support from some quarters. But the third way he said you could be treated is this notion of not being treated at all. And Perry said that was actually the most difficult part of his experience. And I was a little surprised by that. I thought it would be this, the physical and mental abuse he was taking in the basketball games. But he said it was this sense of isolation that he felt on his own campus that was the most difficult part, of being ignored. And for him, it was sort of a special type of being ignored. He called it a superhero nobody phenomenon. And so for a couple hours a week, when they played at home, maybe for 2 or 3 hours, on Wednesday and Saturday, at Memorial Gym, there were 10,000 people cheering for him, and he was a superhero for a few hours. But as soon as he walked off the court, he was a nobody. And that I talked to a lot of his African-American classmates, and they expressed the same sentiments about this feeling of isolation on the campus. A classmate of his, Eileen Carpenter, told me she had grown up in the Whites Creek area here in Nashville, and she lived at home, and she remembered her first day of class driving onto campus, taking a seat in the front row of her class, and looking around and noticing that nobody else sat in the row with her, and nobody sat in the row behind her. Another woman, Bobby Jean Perdue, who was from rural Kentucky, and her town had raised enough money to send her to Vanderbilt. And she talked about showing up at, I think, either chemistry or biology class, and whoever sat next to you became your lab partner in the class. And she said, what if you arrived in your class early to take a seat, and you noticed as everybody walks in that no one's choosing to sit next to you, and how that made you feel? Fraternities and sororities dominated the social scene at Vandy, and not only were they completely segregated, it was more than that. They didn't even have African-American fraternities and sororities on campus yet, so there wasn't even an alternative on campus. So there was very little to do on the weekends, and all the students talked about the lonely nights they spent in their dormitory where they could hear the African-American bands playing at the frat houses that they weren't allowed to go to, in the hypocrisy of that. And so Perry said that it was during these 4 years on campus and 10, 20 years after he left Vanderbilt that this not being treated at all was the most difficult thing for him to deal with. But he never quit. Growing up, he had read a lot of books about Jackie Robinson, and he really admired the sports pioneer Jackie Robinson. He would ask himself, what would Jackie Robinson do in this situation? And it was to never quit. His mom, who was a very religious person, would tell him to put on the full armor of God, and that's what would protect him in the most difficult circumstances. And then the last game of his career was here at home in Nashville against Mississippi State, the same team where, he had been holding hands in the locker room down there in Starkville. So it was a significant opponent for him, and it was a significant game that he dedicated to his mom. He had been very close to her, and she passed away from cancer before his senior season. And I noticed that one of your speakers, I think the last speaker in this sampler is Dr. Spickard. And I believe Dr. Spickard was the Wallace family doctor back then, because Dr. Spickard III is my doctor. And so my publisher and editor asked me, why are you including the name of Perry Wallace's mom's doctor in your book? Like, it's an unnecessary detail. I said, well, it's because his son is my doctor. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Perry dedicates the last game of his career to his mom, and he plays the best game of his life. He has 27 points and 28 rebounds, and that's as many rebounds as a team might get in a game. And he saves the best for last. In the last minute of this game, he dunks the ball, which sounds like a normal thing for a basketball player to do, but it was against the rules at the time. And I have a whole chapter in the book about this banning of the slam dunk in the mid-'60s to early '70s that had very obvious racial undertones to it. And if I can tell you guys one quick basketball story, I mentioned that Perry learned how to dunk when he was 12 years old. And the person who taught him how to dunk was named David Lattin. And David Lattin started his career here in Nashville at TSU. But before he ever played a single game at TSU, he transferred to Texas Western, which is that team that beat Kentucky in this famous game. And early in that game against Kentucky in the national championship, David Lattin, who was this really powerful dunker, dunked it hard over Pat Riley, the Kentucky player who became the coach of the Lakers and runs the Miami Heat now. And the ball bounced off of Pat Riley's head. It was really embarrassing for Kentucky, and Adolph Rupp was going crazy. This set the tone for that game, which was an embarrassing loss for Adolph Rupp. Well, the very next year is Perry Wallace's freshman year at Vandy, and he's the second coming of David Lattin, who had taught him how to dunk. And Vandy plays a game at Kentucky, and in the first minute of that game, Perry does the same thing. He dunks it over Dan Issel, who was a star of Kentucky teams then and played in the NBA for a long time. And Perry told me after he dunked the ball, as he's running down the court, he could see this old man going nuts on the sideline, and it was Adolph Rupp, who was complaining about what he thought was an affront to fundamental basketball, And so the very next year will be Perry's first year on the Vanderbilt varsity. He's going to play Kentucky twice a year for the next 3 years. David Lattin is coming into Adolph Rupp's conference, in essence. Adolph Rupp's the head of the College Basketball Rules Committee, and he has the slam dunk outlawed in college basketball. And they called it the Alcindor rule at the time, after Lou Alcindor. But I make the case in the book that Kentucky wasn't going to play UCLA unless they met in the tournament, but they were going to play Vandy 6 more times over Perry Wallace's career, at least 6 more times. And so Perry Wallace, this person that most people have never heard of before, had a lot to do with the banning of the slam dunk. And so Perry dunks the ball in the last minute of his last game, and it's this triumphant moment. He gets a standing ovation from the Vanderbilt crowd. Vandy's won the game. He's never been more popular here in his hometown of Nashville. And at that very moment, he makes a decision that he knows will make him as unpopular as he's ever been. And it was simply the most courageous thing that Perry ever did, and it was simply telling the truth. And he decided after this game that he had been through an awful lot that people needed to hear about and to learn from. And so he told a reporter from the Tennessean that he had a lot to say, and so the next day he sat down with Frank Sutherland, who was just a young reporter at the paper then, became the editor later, at Mr. Sutherland's apartment on Love Circle. And Perry talked about being kicked out of the church and about the way Walter Murray was treated by his English professor, and the game at Ole Miss, and everything he had been through, and especially the isolation and loneliness that he felt on his own campus. And Perry said that in giving this interview, he suspected he was writing his ticket out of town, and that the Vanderbilt community and the white community in Nashville wasn't going to want to hear what he had to say, that people wanted this to be a happy ending to this story and to say, we've done it, we've integrated the team and the league. There's nothing more to do here? And Perry said there was a lot more to do. There were a lot of unanswered questions. And even this door that he had opened, it didn't really seem like anybody was bringing anyone else behind him. Vanderbilt didn't have another black player. Nobody else in the entire league did, except for Auburn. Perry only played against one other African-American player in the SEC his whole career. So he was wondering, what I have done, has it been worth anything? But he suspects that people will be coming behind him, and he said he had a moral obligation to them and to the university to tell the truth about what he had been through so that the situation would be better for the next generations of kids that would come behind him. And so he told the truth in this article that ran on the front page of the paper the next day. And I talked to Mr. John Siegenthaler and to Mr. Sutherland, and they said the phones rang off the hook with Vandy fans calling to cancel their subscriptions to the Tennessean. And they were calling Perry Wallace ungrateful and wishing him good riddance out of town. And they said that, that this sense of that he was ungrateful was the overwhelming sense after this article. If you read it today, it's pretty unbelievable that that would be the opinion that people have. But you can understand, maybe, if you think about how people were in Nashville in 1970, that's how they reacted. Perry expected that's how they would react. And so he graduates with his engineering degree. He's drafted by the Philadelphia 76ers of the NBA, and takes that opportunity to finally, in high school he wanted to move up north. So this is his chance. He's drafted by the Sixers. He doesn't make the team, but the coach is a guy named Dr. Jack Ramsey, a famous NBA basketball coach, who takes a real liking to Perry. And even though he doesn't make the team, he's concerned about Perry's future. And so he hooks him up with two jobs. One with a minor league basketball team in Wilmington, Delaware, which is very close to Philadelphia. And so Perry can keep living in Philly. And the other job that Coach Ramsey helps him get is as a teacher at Bartram High School in inner city Philadelphia, which is where Earl the Pearl Monroe had played high school basketball. And can you imagine a pro basketball player now also teaching math during the day? So that's what Perry's doing. And he's also a volunteer assistant coach on the basketball team at Bartram. And there's a great 8th grade ball player there that Perry helps coach, whose name was Joe Bryant. And his nickname is Jelly Bean Bryant. And his son's name is Kobe Bryant. And so Perry helped coach Kobe Bryant's dad when his dad was in high school. Meanwhile, Perry's also serving a 6-year commitment in the National Guard. He goes to work a year later for Ron Brown, the famous Democratic operative, at the National Urban League for a year. Then he attends law school at Columbia University Law School, where one of his heroes, Paul Robeson, had gone to school. After graduating from Columbia, Perry becomes an attorney for the U.S. Justice Department. He's a trial attorney for the Justice Department for about 7 years. Then he becomes a professor at the University of Baltimore. And now for the last 20-plus years, he's been a professor at American University Law School. And so when the book came out, I'm getting to a bit of the happy present now. The first event that we did together was in Washington, D.C., at Politics and Prose bookstore, a great independent bookstore in D.C., and my family lives there, Perry's family lives there, all of his colleagues from the law school were there, so the environment couldn't have been warmer and friendlier at the bookstore. But the next day, we were both flying back down to Nashville to do our first appearance here about the book. And Perry was thinking about the last time he told the truth here in Nashville, how things went. And so he said, I think we're headed into a hot situation down there. And we were going to be speaking at the downtown library in the big auditorium there. And I've lived here now since I came here as a freshman in 1988, and I believe Nashville's a friendly place. And I was hoping that Perry would experience some of this new Nashville, but neither of us were sure what was going to happen. But thankfully, that auditorium was full, and there were 150 more people across the hall watching on TV. And when Perry stood up, I'll skip ahead here. This picture here is when Perry was announced to the crowd, and you can see he got a standing ovation. And so that was a really rewarding moment for me at that moment. And the whole night went great. People were really interested in what Perry had to say. We spoke for about an hour. And afterwards, folks lined up to buy their books. And I was watching as people approached Perry to have him sign their books. And this line went on for 2 hours because people wanted so much time with Perry. And it was a lot of people who were about his age. Perry is 69 years old now. And these had been classmates of his at Vanderbilt, class of 1970. And they were crying. They were still crying by the time they got up to Perry, or they had bloodshot eyes. And they were saying things like, I wish I had been paying attention back then. I could have done something to reach out for you, and I didn't. You know, you're my hero, forgive me. Those were the types of messages that Perry was receiving. And I asked Perry about that afterwards, and I said, you're saying the same things that you said back in 1970. People ran you out of town then, now they're crying and hugging you. You're saying the same thing. How do you square that? And he said back when he told the truth back in 1970, he suspected people wouldn't want to hear it, but that he had faith in the way that people change and history changes, that if he just continued to tell the truth and live this good, honest life, that someday people would come to appreciate him and his story. And he said it might take 10, 20, 30, 40. It took over 40 years, but finally it happened. And so now when I go out and speak to people and they learn Perry's story, that's what gives me the greatest pleasure, is they do appreciate Perry's story now. And in that way, we're all the people that Perry's been waiting for almost 50 years now. It's pretty incredible. So this picture is Simone Charlie, who is a star student and athlete at Vanderbilt now. And she's the best player on the soccer team. She was just invited to the Olympic trials, essentially, for the U.S. women's soccer team. She was invited to the Olympic trials for the U.S. women's track team prior to the Rio Olympics. She's also a great student. And Perry came to campus this past fall. All the freshmen at Vanderbilt had to read the adult version of my book. Or at least they were given the book. I don't know if they read it or not. And so she read it. And she was one of many students that came up to see Perry. And it was really fun to be there. I took that picture because she was thanking him for opening the doors, you know, and that she was having the opportunity to excel at what she loved thanks to Perry and the sacrifices he made. And so this scene was happening over and over again. This was a really cool event that happened. Did anybody go to the Equality Weekend game at Vandy a few weeks ago? So this is Perry Wallace's sister, Jessie, Chancellor Zeppos, and Perry's nephew, Willie. And that's Luke Cornett, who's wearing a jersey that says P. Wallace on it. And so at the men's game that weekend and the women's basketball game that weekend, the Vanderbilt players wore these special jerseys that Nike made for them that didn't have the players' names on them but had Nashville civil rights figures' names on them. And so there were 21 different Nashville civil rights figures, you know, from Perry Wallace to Reverend Lawson to Kelly Miller Smith, and people I'd never heard of before, like Coinus Enix, who helped get the poll tax abolished in Nashville. A really interesting group of men and women. John Sigenthaler was on one of the jerseys, and Mrs. Sigenthaler was there to see it. And this is Godfrey Dillard, Perry's freshman teammate. And if you've read the book, if you haven't read the book, it's over here for you to get. If you've read the book, you know Godfrey Dillard was basically run off the team for just also telling the truth about what it was like on campus as a black student. And he was run off the team. And here he is, he and Chancellor Zeppos getting along so great. He gave a toast to the chancellor and to the university. And so you see some real reconciliation happening. And Perry has a phrase, he's got so many good phrases, a phrase for that too. And Perry says that reconciliation without the truth is just acting. And that a lot of times people want to get to this reconciliation point without doing the hard work that it takes to make it meaningful. You know, and it's without the truth. And so everyone's just going through the motions and it's just acting. But he and Godfrey feel like, you know, some real things have happened here. And people are truly learning their stories. Some things are happening on campus now for the students on campus today to make it a better place. And so they're satisfied that this is a real type of reconciliation. And so what I wanted to do now is show you a couple videos, if we have time. The first is a recap of this Equality Weekend, which I think you'll find pretty cool.
The point that I want to make about what we're doing this weekend.
Good point. It's playing on my computer.
This is all about that question. What happened? How
I'll start it over.
Why did it change? When did it change? And so Black History Month comes every year. And like so many other holidays, we get lost in the concept of just celebrating. And so we took the position of saying, yeah, we're going to celebrate, but we're going to honor and we're going to educate.
Joining our student athletes for team introductions are several of...
Can you turn it up, Santi?
And I think that's the point that I want to make about what we're doing this weekend.
Sorry, guys.
And I think that's the point that I want to make about what we're doing this weekend. This is all about that question. What happened? How did it change? Why did it change? When did it change? And so Black History Month comes every year. And like so many other holidays, we get lost in the concept of just celebrating. And so we took the position of saying, yeah, we're going to celebrate, but we're going to honor and we're going to educate.
Joining our student athletes for team introductions are several of Nashville and Vanderbilt's leading civil rights figures. As part of this weekend's celebration, the student athletes are now revealing specially created jerseys with the names of their honoree on their back.
You know, I was there in 1971, and I would never thought in my wildest dreams that Vanderbilt would ever do anything like this to honor people of color.
Listen, this was an outstanding honor. You know, I've been around Nashville my entire life growing up, and a lot of the names, these people that you heard, they were all names that I knew. They were people, they were my neighbors, they were my friends, they went to the same schools.
You know, everything that we do day in and day out as coaches and as teachers and as leaders is to prepare future leaders. And we want to prepare future leaders that go out and are bold and are strong and are courageous, and to be able to just be a part of a weekend like this with leaders who have been bold and courageous, and for our players and our student athletes to learn about the civil rights movement in Nashville, and to be able to pick the brains of all of these people in this room is really, truly an honor, and we're so grateful to be a part of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, hailing from Detroit, Michigan, is this year's recipient. And yes, it is, in fact, Mr. Godfrey Dillard.
You know, I've gotten awards in my life, but I have to admit this is one of the, I think it tops it all because, you know, my Vanderbilt experience had so much to do with my formative years and led me to be who I am today. So it was just, I was totally shocked and totally surprised. You know, I would never thought that I was going to get something like that from Vanderbilt.
It is so inspiring to just be able to watch them unveil their jerseys and see who they're representing, and them to know so much about these people.
And to see that the city and the state are able to give such recognition to their efforts, and to understand the magnitude of their efforts for my father, for everyone, is amazing.
For them to see Vanderbilt doing this means that all is possible. That Vanderbilt's going to acknowledge African Americans who have stood up under a great test of time, historical test of time. That speaks volumes as to how they view their own institution and where their institution stands in the world on the side of social justice and the importance of social mission. I mean, it means a lot. It'll let them know that they're the V of Vanderbilt, maybe to some extent points towards a victory in social mission.
And then I'll show you one other video. This is Dr. Frank Dobson, who is the director of the Vanderbilt Black Cultural Center. And he was linking the story of the book to Martin Luther King for students, and also to sort of present-day cultural, political situations in what I thought was a very interesting way.
Strong inside, trying to help us understand. Have you ever been the first or the only one at something? Then you know what it's like to have to be strong inside. Have you ever felt lonely even though others may have thought that you were known or popular and perhaps even a commodity in a particular setting? Then perhaps you have had to be strong inside. In a chapter entitled Ticket Out of Town, Andrew Maraniss, the author of Strong Inside, captures the feelings Perry Wallace felt during his 4 years at Vanderbilt as a star basketball player, as a black pioneer who broke the color barrier in the SEC, but also as a young man who felt alienated and alone. In the chapter, Maraniss discusses a news article about Perry, an interview of the star student athlete. The interview appeared in the Tennessean, and the title of the article was Lonely for four years for Star, They Meant Well. Within the interview, Perry Wallace, then a graduating senior, talks about the loneliness and feelings of alienation he felt during his 4 years on campus. When the article hits, campus leaders and administrators are upset, as though Perry was ungrateful, as though he was trying to besmirch Vanderbilt's name and reputation. One has to remember, of course, that it was bold for Vanderbilt to be the first school in the SEC to do what it did. But the words of head coach Roy Skinner, the man who recruited Perry, are perhaps the most telling. After reading the interview, these are the words of Coach Skinner. God, I don't know how he took it for 4 years. It was a lot worse than I thought it was. I felt for him, and I really admired him for doing it. He was just trying to help us understand. He was just trying to help us understand. I repeat those words because they bring to mind the title of the last book written by the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his 1967 work, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. I would submit to you that what Perry Wallace was doing in that interview and throughout his trying 4 years on our campus is that he was challenging Vanderbilt, issuing a call to the campus that he loved, but which didn't always understand his situation. He was saying, indeed he was asking, where do we go from here, Vanderbilt? Chaos or community? I know that our commitment is to community, and the voices in this book, Strong Inside, challenge us to reject chaos, the chaos wrought of difference, which we see in America and in the world today. The voices in this book compel us to seek community, no matter how difficult that may be, no matter how long it takes, like Perry Wallace's white teammate, Bob Warren, who decades later seeks out Perry to apologize for not being as much of an ally as he perhaps could have been back then. Or the voice of Godfrey Dillard, who, like Perry, was a black student pioneer here at Vandy and an athlete, but who, unlike Perry, did not stay at Vanderbilt. The voices in the book speak to us today, trying to help us understand that the dilemma confronting us is the one which Dr. King posed in 1967 in his work, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which is also the year when he spoke here at Vanderbilt for the Impact Symposium. The choice is still between chaos or community, and the only way for us to choose community is to echo the sentiments of Coach Skinner and to empathize with those who might feel alienated or lonely, and to realize that they are trying to help us understand their plight. This is such an important book for this time and for our campus. I am glad that we will be discussing it this year.
Okay, so with whatever time we have left, how much time do we have left? 15 minutes? Great. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has about Perry or the book or anything that's on your mind. Yes, ma'am.
Tell us a little bit more about this book that you have synthesized for students.
Okay.
Before I knew that was coming out, I bought a copy of the grown-up book for my 16-year-old grandson.
Yes.
Should I send him another one?
Oh. Yes, so she's asked about the new version of the book for students. And the reason that it exists is thanks to another Nashville author that y'all may know, Ruta Sepetys, who's written Salt to the Sea is her latest book, Between Shades of Gray, which is not related to 50 Shades of Gray. I met Ruta, and she introduced me to her publisher in New York. Penguin has a young readers division called Philomel. And she said they were looking for stories about people that have accomplished something significant, but that most people have never heard of before. So my book was right up their alley. The main difference is that the new version is about 1/4 the length of the original. And so I've removed background about Nashville and Vanderbilt, or condensed that. There are some minor characters that aren't in the new version of the book, but it's essentially telling the same story, just in a more condensed way. So I think even adults who don't want to read a 400-page book but would rather read a shorter version might like it. It's not a Dr. Seuss version of the book or anything. And in fact, I have a disclaimer in the front that I haven't taken any of the derogatory language out either, which a couple teachers have raised a concern about, but I thought it was important that kids understand exactly what Perry went through. And he's had people over the years tell him, oh, it wasn't that bad, you know. And I would have been contributing to that if I'd made it seem like it was easier than it was, you know, by sort of sanitizing some of the scenes. And so I felt it was important in respect to Perry and the other pioneers to show exactly what they went through. Yes, ma'am.
I think I'm too emotional. I better not talk.
Okay.
I have been called. And most people in this city chose not to really know him. They saw him from a into this day. So I feel for this guy.
Well, I feel for you. Thank you for saying something. Thank you. Bless you. Yes, ma'am.
Have you run into any statistics saying if the Northeast Ivy League schools had already brought in undergraduates who were of different nationalities, particularly Afro-Americans?
Oh, but was Vanderbilt sort of late to the game? Yes. They were, in a basketball sense, you know, the Big Ten had integrated Indiana in 1947. So the SEC was about 20 years behind. The ACC, which is schools like North Carolina and Duke and Maryland, had integrated around the same time as the SEC. They were the last two conferences in the country. But you had African-American students at Columbia dating back to the early 1900s. I mean, so Vandy was 60 years behind those schools. Yes? Is there a movie version coming? There's a documentary version coming, and I do have, there's a woman that went to school at Vanderbilt who's a producer who's expressed some interest in a movie. So we'll see. My father has written about 12 books, and he's sold the movie rights to several of them over the years. None of them have been made into movies, and so they just keep getting renewed as potential movies. And so he'll say that his books are in various stages of not being made into a movie. And so I'm going to use that line, too, until it happens.
What about his family? Does he have any kids that are playing basketball?
Oh, no, sir. He has a daughter, Gabby, who's adopted. She's about 22 or 3 years old. And there's a chapter in the book about this. She has Asperger's. And when they adopted Gabby in the early 80s, or in the 80s, there wasn't as much known about Asperger's at the time. And Perry and his wife Karen were told she'll never graduate from high school, no chance she'll ever go to college. She's just graduated from college. And so Perry will say what he's proud of most in his life isn't being a basketball pioneer, it's his daughter, Gabby. But she doesn't play sports. The closest to that was Godfrey Dillard, his one African-American teammate, who leaves. And so they had a real discussion about, was Godfrey abandoning him? Did Perry resent the fact that Godfrey was leaving? Perry understood why this was happening. I say he was kicked off the team, but when he was kicked off the team, Godfrey decided to just transfer. He said, if I'm not going to be on the basketball team, I don't need to be here. And there's a lot in the book about that. Perry's other close friend was a guy named Pat Toomey, who was white and had grown up in a military family around the world, and so he was a little more cosmopolitan, and they were good friends, but Pat Toomey was injured in a basketball game also, and so he quit basketball and just played football, which I don't really think football is safer, you know. I don't know the logic in that, but he went on to play in the NFL for many years, but that was his other good friend on the team, and he wasn't there. So Perry really was quite alone without people understanding what he was going through. His best friend was Walter Murray, who had gone to high school with and who was here also as a student at Vandy, and they remained very close up until Murray died maybe 20 years ago up in Boston.
What has been the reaction to the book in different parts of the country? How has that reaction varied?
That's a good question. And part of that question gets to a little chip on the shoulder, or my shoulder that I have. So when I was writing this book, I spent maybe 7 years writing it before I started looking for a publisher, because I was just doing it at night and weekends, and I knew I couldn't meet a deadline that somebody else would impose on me. And when I started looking for a publisher, most of whom are in New York, they were saying, this will just be a regional interest book. Only people in Nashville will be interested in it. We're not interested. And so that's why Vanderbilt University Press, thankfully, is the publisher of the book. They weren't as concerned about that. But I'm happy when I look at the Amazon rankings. If you look at the top 20, I can see the top 20 markets that the book is selling in. And Nashville's #1, but more than half of the top 20 are outside of the South. So that makes me pretty happy that people are receiving this story well all over the country. I think because it's about more than just, it's obviously about one person at one campus, but I'm trying to make it a universal story. And so if people take the time to get into the book, they realize that. And Perry is such a charismatic and smart and insightful person that I think anybody can relate to what he's saying. The fun thing for me has been speaking at schools, and by the time I'm done speaking, the kids like him and they want to meet him. And in Austin, Texas, and in Washington, D.C., kids ask me, do you think he'll move here? Like, they wanted him to move to their city. So that's been a pretty cool reaction around the country. So, yes, ma'am.
What are you doing today, and what's next for you?
Okay. Well, as I said, I wrote this book on the side of a regular job. About a year after the book came out, I quit that job. So this was maybe a year ago, because I decided this is what I love to do. And I felt like I wasn't working when I was writing this book. I didn't want to spend another 8 years if I had to write another book. So I left a comfortable job in health insurance, and so now I'm a freelancer for ESPN. I write they have a website called The Undefeated, which is a sports and race website. Because Vanderbilt has required my book last year and they're requiring it again next year, I'm working part-time over there to help put on programs related to the story. And then I had been working on the kids' version of the book for about 9 months. Last week I got a contract to do my second book, and I had submitted 3 ideas through an agent, and the publisher chose my third favorite of those ideas. But at least it was one of my top 3 favorites. So that's what I'm writing. I guess I can say it now that I have a contract, but it's going to be about the very first U.S. Olympic basketball team, which was at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And James Naismith, who invented basketball, was there and presented the medals. And so this will be a story, again, I hope not just about basketball, but what was happening in Germany and the discussions about should we boycott these games and, fascism, and so it might be relevant, and write this story about, that will make kids think, again, about things beyond just basketball. Yes, sir, I'll come back here.
If you want to see a really beautiful sight, you should go to Martin Luther King High School, which in fact is Pearl High School, where Perry graduated, and where my granddaughter now attends. And if you watch the students coming out, you will see every color of the rainbow. It is just about the most integrated school, north, south, east, or west, I have ever seen.
That's right. So MLK Magnet School in North Nashville is the building where Pearl High School used to be. And if you go in the building, underneath the bleachers in the gymnasium, they have a museum to the old Pearl High School, where they have all the trophies that Perry's teams won. But most interestingly, they have class pictures going back to the 1890s. And this was the only African-American high school in town from 1800s till mid-20th century. And they have class pictures where you can see these kids from like 1897 and dressed up in their Sunday best. It's a really interesting exhibit there. Yes, ma'am.
Will there be 2 versions of the 1930s?
No, this one I'm writing just straight for kids first. But it'll be, again, written in a way that adults would find it fine too, but it'll just be a shorter, maybe 30 to 40,000 word book instead of closer to 200,000 word book.
You're not afraid that that's age discrimination?
No, because I like the shorter version better too. Yes, sir.
I think I'm correct in that after Perry Wallace, Vanderbilt was very slow to bring more black athletes into basketball, whereas other teams in the SEC, Auburn, Alabama, Mississippi, just made an abrupt conversion almost. Was it the Vanderbilt athletic alumni that were responsible for
For the slow? You're right that there were other schools, and ironically, some of the schools that had been the most difficult for Perry to play at were the fastest to flip. So, University of Alabama was the first school to have an all-black starting lineup in SEC basketball by 1972. So, just 2 years after Perry graduated, and won the SEC championship in 72, 73, and 74. And it was because of their coach, C.M. Newton, who later became the coach here at Vandy. Coach Newton was a good person who had integrated the team at Transylvania up in Kentucky. When he came to Alabama, he asked his boss, who was Bear Bryant, could he recruit anybody he wanted? And Bryant, I think, didn't care about basketball, so he said, fine, do whatever you want. And Coach Newton recruited all the best players in the state of Alabama who happened to be black. And he actually showed his first black player, who was Wendell Hudson, that Tennessean article that we've been talking about. And he sat down with him and said, let's not let this happen here. And so he was a pretty thoughtful, insightful person, and his players really liked him, and they were successful. At Vanderbilt, I think it was probably a combination of Coach Skinner was, if any of you knew him, I'm not disparaging Coach Skinner, but I don't think he was bent on social change or anything. He was a pretty simple Western Kentucky farm boy, and Perry speaks highly of him. Godfrey Dillard does not, to this day, think highly of him at all. I don't think Coach Skinner really recognized an opportunity that he had. I think there were some alums that were not too excited. I know there were alums that sent death threats to Perry's house when he was being recruited, and petitions to the coach saying they would never come to another game if they recruited a black player. So there certainly wasn't a groundswell of support to continue on. And in fact, I worked at Vandy in the mid-90s as the PR person for the basketball team, and I remember being at a game at the University of Georgia in probably 96 or 7, where it was the first time Vandy had 5 black players on the court at the same time. So it took almost till the 21st century for Vandy to get to that point. How much time? We're out of time. Thank you. I'll be sitting over here if anyone has more questions. I've got books if anybody would like them. Thank you.